Welcome to the AIOps Evolution Weekly podcast, and I'm your host, Sean McDermott. On this week's episode, we'll take a look at why AIOps is an overall strategy, not just a platform. Bill Driscoll and I walk you through the vision needed to implement a meaningful and impactful plan, what it means to look at real roles within your company for AIOps, and how machine learning impacts an overall business plan. Join us as we look at the best practices for objectives, metrics, team management, and building a roadmap through the transformation to AIOps. Enjoy the episode. Today's podcast is brought to you by Windward Consulting Group, and I'd like to take a moment to thank them for their sponsorship. Windward is the global leader in leveraging AIOps technologies to find and detect operational issues. We found that many IT leaders look at selecting tools to solve the problem rather than defining a strategy with a measurable path forward. But IT leaders' visions are bigger than a tool. In fact, as IT grows exponentially more complex, it's something only AI and automation, what we call AI operations, can handle at scale. Windward helps companies create an AI operations strategy that connects your vision to a roadmap for success. If you'd like to learn more and discuss an AIOps investment plan for your organization, feel free to email me at sean.mcdermott@windward.com or go to www.windward.com. Welcome, everybody, to this week's AIOps Weekly podcast. I'm your host, Sean McDermott, and my co-host, Bill. Today, we're going to be talking about AIOps as a strategy. So one of the things that when I think about AIOps, what we're hearing a lot in the market today is confusion and noise, right? So when you get into this space, when you get into AI, into operations at all, in general, over the years, we've been in it for almost 30 years, there tends to be terms that get jumped in along the way that marketing people grab onto, and eventually they become the term and everyone kind of grabs that term as part of their own. And we're seeing that now with AIOps. Like we saw it years ago with BSM, business service management, and automation back in the early 2000s, and now we're seeing AIOps everywhere. And I think I've said this before, pre-pandemic when I went to some shows, it was just amazing how much people had AIOps on their marketing material, on their billboards. So I think, Bill, what's your thoughts on this? Because when I think of AIOps, I think of AIOps more as a strategy and less as a platform. And I think it's the introduction of AI into the operations world, into your IT operations model, is really seismic, I think, for where we're at today. And we really need to be looking at it as an overall strategy, not as an individual platform.
No, I completely agree. I think that there's many different pieces that come into making it successful, right? It isn't just introducing algorithms, right? It's introducing data and getting data, and it's also the driving automation, and it's involving organizations and roles. And so I think, as with any sort of, it's a complex change is basically what I'm saying. It isn't just replacing just one tool, because it is relying on AI ops. You want to apply it down at observability and kind of out to your individual domain specific areas. You want to apply it at where you're aggregating performance data, apply it where you're doing event management, and also where you're resolving incidents, and driving automation. And then it also applies in kind of the DevOps chain. And so I think it really does need to be looked at more broadly. And I think while there's an overarching kind of vision and kind of view that sort of the leadership team or the sponsor team needs to have, you got to break it down into the pieces so that it can really be executed. And I think that's, going from that vision to execution is kind of where, a lot of the effort needs to be in kind of organizing that work and organizing kind of how it's going to roll out.
Yeah, I think where the confusion comes in, right, is we talk a lot around the use cases, right? And the use cases right now are primarily focused on event management, event handling, all the things you said, right? Detection, root cause analysis, correlation. But when you think about the operations world, right, you've got things like service desk, right? Service requests coming in, that's part of operations. It's It's
Yep.
not just, looking at events and resolving events, right? So configuration management, change management, all these operational areas. And to right now, where we're seeing AI ops primarily is in this use case of what we just talked about, event handling, event management. And that makes sense, right? Because AI is very, and machine learning is very good at processing mass amounts of data and looking for patterns.
Hmm.
But when you look at the rest of the operational world, where does AI play into configuration management? Where does it
Right.
play into request management? Where does it play into virtual bots? And we're seeing all these
Hmm.
things happening today, right? When you look at companies like ServiceNow with their virtual, the bot-driven um, chat clients, and so I think that when you look at AI, and you bring up a really, really good point, and that is the introduction of AI and ML, right, is really going to lead us down the path of new processes, new ways of doing things, new methodologies, new ways of measurements. It's going to change how people do work. So traditional IT operations organizations are going to look different just from the
Yep.
introduction of AI machine learning.
Right.
So to sit back and say, oh well, I just bought an AI ops platform, whether it be Big Panda, Moogsoft, things like that, is really what I believe is kind of narrow thinking as far as the
Hmm.
impact of where AI and ML is going and going to have on the organization. So
Right.
one needs to kind of step back and say, okay, what does all this mean to us? Like, what is it going
Right.
to, and what is, and you brought up kind of these steps. And one of
Hmm.
the things that we talk a lot about is what is your vision, right? What are you
Hmm.
looking for? So, um, so when we think about AI ops as a strategy, there's primarily 6 areas that we look at, and we can delve into each one of these. The first one is vision. What is your vision? And then the
Hmm.
second is what is your objectives? What are you trying? What are your discernible objectives over the next quarter, 2 quarters, 18 months, 3 years to get out of introducing AI and ML? And then what are your core measurements? How are you going to measure those? And then you're
Hmm.
looking at fourth level is team, and then the roadmap, and then execution. So let's kind of delve into each one of these. So Bill, what's
Yeah.
your thoughts on
Let me,
putting together a vision for an AI ops strategy?
when you look at vision, you really have to equate AI ops with improvement. Where do you need to improve in your whole domain of IT service management, IT ops? And so you look at questions. If you go back to last year, when did you ask, how could we have prevented that outage? The answer is often, we didn't, we're sifting through just large amounts of data, and it's like finding needle in a haystack. Well, that's where AI can come into a play. Or how did we not know the customer had those issues? Or how did we not release that application on time? Well, because testing is taking so long. So any areas that you have improvements that you really see you need to make in your IT operations, IT service management, that's a perfect candidate for sort of making up your vision, which then turns into objectives and measurements in your IT ops. And I think it does come down to things as simple as that.
Yeah, I think, I look at it a little bit more higher level than that, right? Because when you're looking at AI ops, everything you said is correct. But when I think about the vision of what we're trying to do, what someone's trying to do, the reality is that all this is going to take capital, right? It's
Hmm.
going to take money. It's going to take time.
Yeah.
It's going to take resources, deploying a new product, looking at existing technology, how you're going to integrate this technology in, or how you're going to replace this technology. So the first thing, what I look at as far as vision is what are we trying to improve, and where are we going to, what is the business case for this, right? And the more use
Hmm.
cases you can put together, the better. And this is where working with an outside consultant who's been doing a lot of work in the AI ops space is probably prudent, is that you can start looking at a lot of different use cases of where these things are going to come into play, and start using that to build your business case, because ultimately you're going to have to use this vision to garner support, right? You're going to have to garner support from above
Hmm.
you, right, to make the investment. and say, hey, look, we think that this is worth a half a million, $1 million investment. Some of our clients absolutely are making those types of investments, and how we're going to pay it
Mm-hmm.
back, and what we expect to happen out of this. And then you also want to use that vision to articulate the strategy to your team and the people who are going to be doing the work and getting them on
Mm-hmm.
board, right? Because they're going to there's going to be a lot of questions about this. And we've talked about this before. When you talk about AI, machine learning, people start thinking, okay, what does it mean to me? What does it mean to my job? And what does it mean to my livelihood? And if we can use this information to help
Mm-hmm.
fill those gaps in, because if you create questions without answers, they will answer themselves, and usually not in the way that you want them to. So a really well formulated vision
Yeah.
is like, hey, this is why we're doing this. This is the role that people will play. This is how we're going to deploy it. These are really the goals of what we're trying to get out of this over the next several years. And there may be, and being honest with people, right? There may be some part of your ROI about staff reductions, but as we've talked about many times,
Mm-hmm.
staff reductions in certain areas mean, and investment in new technologies mean there's openings in others, right? There's jobs that are around
Right.
today
Right.
that didn't exist 5 years ago, right? So this is a good opportunity to
Mm-hmm.
start using this vision to talk to your staff about where they're going and what they want to do and how they want to be part of this new future. And so to me, that's what really the vision is all about. So let's talk a little bit about
Right.
measurements,
Right.
because I think this
Yeah.
plays off really kind of into what you said. It's all about improvements, right? So if we can't
Mm-hmm.
articulate um, if we can't articulate the objectives of what we're trying to do, right? So when we think about this strategy, we look at objectives as number two. If we can't think about these are the objectives over the next 12 months, 18 months, 36 months, then we're going to have a hard time getting people to understand why we're doing this and getting them on board. So, one objective might be
Right.
to work with one or two use cases, and then within the next six
Mm-hmm.
months, first objective is get a get some technology acquired. And in some cases, that could take a lot of time, right? We've seen customers take 9 months
Mm-hmm.
to acquire new technology, so that needs to be part of the strategy. Can you be doing proof of
Yeah.
concepts ahead of time? And then, so what other objectives do you see that people should be laying out in their plan?
Well, I think a couple points. One is I think that staying focused and biting off a bit at a time and not trying to boil the ocean and try to cover your entire IT environment or infrastructure is critical. I think I've heard the term of are you in an exploration phase or exploitation phase? An exploitation from in a positive way. You're really taking advantage, and I think AI ops is very much in an exploration phase. It isn't something where you go out and say, all right, we've proven everything. We know we can do this and we're going to apply it. We're going to kind of go out aggressively and deploy it across our whole IT. I do think identifying those use cases, the specific parts of your application portfolio or specific parts of your infrastructure or specific problems of reducing MTTR or getting rid of certain outages in certain areas is really the focus. And I think we've seen that when we've had customers buy an AIOps platform, they usually buy it for let's prove it. Let's get the team, let's get the vision kind of proven out in a particular area of our infrastructure, and then go from there. And so, yeah, I think the measurements kind of go typically along that, the improving business value and improving kind of the being able to roll out, new features or services. So that could be tying it to some new part of your infrastructure you're rolling out. It's agility and getting the DevOps sort of CI/CD pipeline, or it's just overall increasing reliability. And really, those three big buckets is sort of where those measurements will apply. And I think it's really critical. It's the beginning phases, at least, of your rollout needs to be very focused.
Yeah, I think I agree, and you bring up a good point, and that is let's not boil the ocean, right? And what are the use cases that
Mm-hmm.
we can apply, and what are the efficiencies of each use case? So one of the things that we should be thinking about is, okay, if we're going to use mean time to mean time to resolution as a key metric, are we going to, tell everybody, hey, we're going to have a reduction of 10% of mean time to MTTR over the next quarter? Is that realistic, right? Because you may be
Hmm.
acquiring technology, you may be learning it, getting trained, you may be building some of your first models, and those models may only deliver 2 or 3%, right? So I think it's okay to talk about incremental, right? Incremental improvements across these
Hmm.
objectives, and those incremental improvements are within individual use cases, and then layering on more use cases going forward. So that brings us, and you kind of touched
Yep.
on it,
Yep.
right, into measurements, right, and some of the key metrics that we need to measure against, and that goes back to the vision, right, of okay, these are the key metrics that we're going to measure against, whether it be mean time to restoration or whatever metric you want it to be, doesn't really matter. Again, this is where a third party consultant might be able to help you because they've done a lot of these implementations and they've seen a lot, and they can say, hey, this is a pretty good metric, or that's a good metric. And the metric has to tie back to the
Hmm.
business, right? Because it's got to tie back to the business case. So we would highly recommend going back to the
Yep.
business case and saying, look, if we're talking about staff reductions, which I hate using that example, but it's an easy one, then where are we
Hmm.
at on staffing today, and where do we expect to be over the next six, 2 quarters, 4 quarters, 8 quarters, and are we actually seeing those reductions? Or are we seeing people being moved out of these roles into other roles? And are we seeing a reduction of mean
Yeah.
time to repair? Because if you look at MTTR and you say, okay, we're looking at a reduction of say 3%, in the next 12 months, we may be looking at a reduction of say 10%. Are we making these incremental um, adjustments and improvements to then back up the business case and keep
Hmm.
everybody on board? Because what's going to happen is, and we see this so many times, is people are going to say, hey, I need amount of money to buy a platform to do X, Y, and Z, and then it kind of gets forgotten and it's bought. Everybody's excited, then it goes into an implementation phase and it takes twice as long to implement, and there's no value realization being
Yep.
shown during that period of time, and people get fatigued, right? They're like, why are we spending all this money, we haven't seen any
Hmm.
improvement? Well, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. And I highly recommend that when you look
Right.
at your objectives and start building metrics around it, you're able to report on a 90-day basis of where you're at on each area, even if you're not moving the needle a lot. Moving a needle every single quarter gets you big gains down the road, right?
Yeah. I also think the measurements provide a focus on data because, right, so many customers look at, we got to collect data, we got to collect data. And I think measurements really make you really stay focused on and refine what data do we actually need to collect? What do we need to kind of measure what we're trying to achieve? And so I think that measurements sort of precede sort of making decisions around the data that you're going to go and what your data strategy is going to be.
Gotcha. I agree. So, all right, so let's talk about roadmap, right? So now you've basically kind of moved your way through the
Hmm.
pyramid. You've got your vision under control. Now you're basically, and you've laid out your objectives for the next, say 2 years, and you've got metrics that measure each one of those objectives on a quarterly basis. Now you got to start to, now you got to start
Hmm.
putting together your roadmap. So, what are your thoughts on that? Because I know you've done a lot of implementations around AI ops platforms. you know, when you sit down and you start thinking about your roadmap, what is your what is your thoughts on that?
Yeah,
Actually,
I
I think first we should talk
yeah,
about
I mean, I
teams,
think
right?
we actually,
Um,
yeah, I think team
yeah.
comes before that. But I do think with the team, and I'll touch on team and roadmap a little bit together and see and get your thoughts. I think with team, it's important that you get the right people and teams involved at the right layers at the right time. So if you're going to brief, your network operations team, now about this big thing we're doing, but you're going to focus, you're going to start with certain applications, or you're going to start with something you're deploying out in the cloud, and you're not even going to affect the network team for a year. You're kind of setting yourself up for some missed expectations. And so I think the executive team, kind of needs to be put in place as to who are the key stakeholders that really understand sort of the longer term direction that we're going. And then I think you enlist the teams that need to enable that or need to execute on that kind of as you go, as you kind of get to that part of your plan, as you get to that part of your roadmap. And sort of tie into roadmap, I think we do a lot of assessments when we make recommendations along kind of a bubble chart that sort of has three different dimensions. One is how hard is this, the ease to which something can be done, with the blockers that we have, the impact that it's going to have, and then overall that kind of bubbles up into a priority. And so I think in the roadmap, you sort of need to look at balancing making an impact, but also getting some quick wins. And I think there's a mix of let's get some quick wins up front, but let's also be working on something that's going to make a really big impact, so that you can make sure you're getting good traction while working towards something bigger. And so that roadmap really is, a combination of sort of, or a sequence, I guess, of a combination of those things.
Yeah, when I think about putting together the right team, right? I think the reality is that a lot of these implementations, you are going to probably be implementing new technology. I would say highly likely, right? Because either you're bringing on additional technology from an existing vendor, right? Or you're saying, hey, we're going to go in a completely different route and bring on a new vendor and maybe replace some of our older technology, our legacy stuff. So there's going to be the team makeup, right, is going to be requiring a fair number of disparate groups, right? Internal people as well as external resources. And those external resources may be the vendor of the technology themselves and maybe a third party consultant. So really understanding how that team is made up and understanding the authority that the team has, I highly recommend that the team always be led by somebody on client staff, right? And not a third party. So it's not led by the consultant or it's not led by because what we're really looking for here too is the leader of this team needs to understand the dynamics of the entire organization because it is going to be impactful. I tend to like having more of a business analyst involved as a team lead, who's someone who understands the context of the organization. They understand the technology. They know where to get the answers and can take a kind of a more holistic approach. Where we have seen people, and I think that this hasn't worked out as well, is when you take, say, you're deploying a technology and your first use case is event management, and you're saying, okay, let's get the person who's running our event management team today to lead this. I don't. I've seen that be less successful in the past, only because they have a more narrow. They historically have a more narrow view of the organization. They kind of see things in their swim lane and don't see things in a bigger way. And I think having somebody with more of a broader background and possibly a little bit more business oriented, technical and business oriented, but not necessarily a coder who's been around for a while can really understand how to maneuver this project and this new roadmap and navigate the landmines, navigate some of the challenges, connect people the right way, and see a broader picture of how this use case applies to another organization and be able to articulate to that other organization to bring them into the fold. So that's what I think about from a team perspective.
Right.
And then from a roadmap perspective, again, um, this is the roadmap's really super important, right? It ultimately, should be broken down into monthly and quarterly milestones. It should really identify dependencies and really be synchronized with the measurements that we came up with earlier. Um, this is so important because the roadmap is going to be ultimately executed, and it's going to be tied to the objectives and the measurements, which is going to be tied to the vision, which is going to be tied to the quarterly readouts to management on how well this investment is going and are we meeting the needs. So,
Yep. Yeah.
oh,
And I just add the roadmap. I mean, a roadmap always has two purposes. One is to get people to focus on the quarter that you're in, right? The 90-day period or 60-day or 30-day period that you're in, and say, let's really focus on this, and keeps reminding people what our focus is right now. But it also lays out the long-term vision that we're not stopping here. This isn't it. We're kind of going somewhere good. And so it also allows you to kind of communicate to those parts of the team maybe that aren't involved yet, hey, by the way, we're coming, this is coming down the road, and sort of sets those, allows you to kind of put off some of the actions and conversations and expectations, to further down the road. So it, just kind of summarize it, it really gets you focused on the near term, what you need to do, but also kind of buys you that time and lays out sort of where people are going, where the organization's going. And I think organizations that don't lay that out, they end up just trying to bite off way more than they should, and they don't really manage scope, the way that they should.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah, so the last area we want to talk about is execution, right? And
Mm-hmm.
What do they say? Execution eats strategy for lunch, right? And you do all
Yeah.
this work, and you put together this vision and these objectives and the measurements, and you assemble your team, and you got your roadmap. It really comes down to the day-to-day, execution, and that takes oversight and that takes
Mm-hmm.
management. And one of the things that one of my investors told me a long time ago is the only thing you can be certain when you put together a plan is that it's wrong, right? And things are going to come up.
Yeah.
Staff are going to leave. You're going to run up against some political headwinds. You may run up with technical challenges. You may run up with procurement challenges of, hey, we're trying to procure something and it's not working, or you're like, oh, we're going to run this in the cloud, and now we've run into an issue where the security team is taking additional review of something
Mm-hmm.
and delaying something by 30 days. So these all have to be taken into account, and execution is really key in all this, and it really comes with oversight. So from my perspective, where does the leader play a role here? And the leader plays a role in breaking down barriers, understanding these challenges, making sure that the execution team is articulating the pros and the cons and the challenges and the milestones that they've made, and ensuring that, and helping the leader make informed decisions on, okay, do we make a left here a little bit, knowing that we're going to go off the road for a little bit and come back onto the roadmap? Do I use some political clout to unhook something that seems to be jammed up? So the leader has to be involved,
Mm-hmm.
right? The executive has to be involved. I would
Yep.
suggest weekly readouts with the team to make sure that everything's going correctly, and that we understand all the the issues and the challenges that were ahead of us, so that we can proactively understand how we get across these. And I think this is where leadership, right, going back to the team and having the right leader in place, the right leader that communicates, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as Bill, from me, the number one thing for me is communication, right? And
Mm-hmm.
if we know about things, if we understand things, then we can fix things. We may not be able to fix them the way we want in the
Right.
timeline we want, but we know. And bad news is not like fine wine; it doesn't get better with time. So making sure that
Yep.
you're engaged with the team, they're communicating well, they're communicating pros and cons and challenges and issues, so that you can take proactive measurements or measures to effectively unhook those challenges.
Yeah. When it comes to execution, my big thing is you want to go. You need to have the professionals involved on proper program management and using things like safe, agile, and the right methodologies that sort of sets up the whole structure, where you have clear ownership of who's driving the vision and the sponsor that's continuously reinforcing that communication, who owns objectives, and you kind of have objective leaders that things can be escalated to, and it's all right, things went wrong, let's get us aligned on what the right objective. And then you have really the sprint leaders and the tasks that are right in front of you to kind of execute on those sprints, and that all done in kind of a safe, agile methodology, or any other agile, lean, or whatnot. And a big part of that is organizational change management, OCM. And so you really want to have, as part of that agile process, your organizational change management involvement, part-time consultant or others that are really putting together kind of the sponsorship message and the training and all the other pieces that really go into making sure the organization's moving along with the rollout and the changes to the technology, the changes to the process. And so getting that structure in place is really the organizations that have been most successful in driving this are those that have put the sort of organizational change and kind of program management disciplines in place.
Yeah, I think we're going to have a whole conversation at some point around organizational change, because that's really important.
Makes
It's
sense.
so critical. I believe it's actually probably one of the most critical aspects of any project, and probably gets assessed the least amount. So, with that, I think we'll wrap it up for today. So, Bill, thanks for your time. It was a great conversation talking about AIOps
Thank you.
strategy, and really how AIOps is we see AIOps as a strategy, not as a platform, not as a particular technology, and how and how to address the vision, the objectives, your measurements, your team makeup to execute the roadmap and what you're executing. I think he brought up some really good points on agile and waterfall and things like that, and ultimately execution. So I want to thank everybody for joining us this week, and have a great week, and we will see you back here next week. Thanks, Bill.
Yep. So yeah, be safe, everyone.
Take care.